Another photo?
This party is lit!
Yes, keep the vibes flowing.
To good times and great friends. I think we should end this.
Today?
I've already signed.
My heart didn't race. It sank.
I didn't want to make a scene.
Okay.
You're not going to fight?
I've been rehearsing this longer than you think.
The champagne was cold. The glasses were arranged in a perfect triangle on the marble counter, catching light like little prisms of everything I wanted people to believe. I had spent 3 days planning this party, not because I loved birthdays, but because I needed proof. Proof that we were still us. That the silence between us was just stress, just timing, just a phase that would pass if I threw enough glitter over it. The playlist was curated down to the second. Upbeat but not frantic. Classy but not stiff. The kind of music that makes people sway without thinking, that fills the gaps where conversation might expose cracks. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror one last time before the guests arrived. My dress fit perfectly. My smile was practiced. My husband stood beside me, scrolling through his phone. And I told myself that was normal. That all couples do this. That love doesn't always look like eye contact. The doorbell rang and I opened it wide, letting in voices and laughter and the kind of energy that makes you forget what you were worried about 5 seconds ago. And for a moment, just a moment, I believed my own performance. The living room filled quickly. Friends I hadn't seen in months hugged me too tightly, complimented the decorations, asked where I got the napkins. I gave them the link. I always gave them the link. Being helpful felt like being valued, and I was starving for that. My husband shook hands, poured drinks, laughed at jokes I couldn't hear from across the room. He was good at this, at being present without actually being there. I watched him from the kitchen, arranging cheese on a board I'd seen on Pinterest, and wondered when I started measuring our marriage in optics instead of intimacy. When had looking happy become more important than feeling it? The cake sat in the center of the table, white frosting smooth as a lie, candles waiting to be lit. I had ordered it myself, picked it up myself. He'd offered to help, but his offer felt like obligation, so I smiled and said I had it handled. I always had it handled. That's what he loved about me, he used to say, that I didn't need him. I didn't realize until much later that not needing someone is not the same as being loved by them. Someone turned the music up, bodies moved in rhythm, drinks splashed, someone's laugh cut through the bass line like a knife through fondant. I floated through the crowd, touching shoulders, refilling glasses, making sure no one noticed I was performing. My best friend grabbed my arm and pulled me into a hug that smelled like vanilla and wine. She whispered that I looked beautiful, that this party was perfect, that she was so happy for me. I nodded into her shoulder and felt my throat tighten. Not from gratitude, from the weight of pretending everything I'd built wasn't already collapsing. She pulled back, searched my face for a second too long, then smiled and let it go. People always let it go when you smile back. I'd learned that years ago. If you make it easy for them to believe you're fine, they'll believe it every time. It's easier than asking the hard questions, easier than watching someone you love admit they're drowning in a room full of balloons. My husband's phone buzzed on the counter. I saw the screen light up, just a name. No message preview, but I felt my stomach fold in on itself anyway. He picked it up without looking at me, walked into the hallway and answered in a voice softer than the one he used with me. I turned back to the cake, adjusting candles that didn't need adjusting, and told myself it was work. It was always work. Or his mother, or a friend, or anything other than what my gut had been whispering for months. I pressed my palms flat against the counter and breathed through my nose the way my therapist taught me, in for 4. Hold for 4, out for 4. It didn't stop the spinning, but it kept me upright. And that was enough. That had always been enough. I had become a woman who measured success in staying standing, not in actually being okay. The music swelled. Someone called my name. I turned, smiled, and walked back into the noise like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just felt my marriage crack a little more in the silence of a hallway. The candles were lit. Everyone gathered around the table, phones raised, recording a moment I would never want to watch again. They sang off key and too loud, the way people do when they've had just enough wine to forget they can't sing. I stood there, hands clasped in front of me, face arranged into joy, and made a wish I didn't believe in. I wished for clarity, for courage, for the strength to stop pretending that effort was the same as love. I blew out the candles and everyone cheered. My husband clapped from the back of the room, his smile polite and distant, and I realized with a sinking certainty that I had been throwing parties for a ghost, or that the man I married had left long before tonight, and I had been too afraid or too proud to admit I was hosting a celebration for a marriage that no longer existed. The smoke from the candles curled upward, thin and temporary, disappearing into the air like every conversation we never had. Someone handed me a knife. I cut the cake into perfect slices, served them with a smile, and wondered how much longer I could keep feeding people sweetness while choking on my own bitterness. He waited until the laughter peaked, until the room was loud enough that no one would notice us slip away. He touched my shoulder, not rough, not tender, just functional, and nodded toward the hallway. I followed him, my heels clicking against the hardwood, my heart already sinking before I knew why. The noise from the party faded behind us, replaced by the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. He stopped near the coat closet, hands in his pockets, and looked at me the way you look at someone you're about to disappoint. Not with malice, not with anger, with something worse, indifference. He said my name, Victoria, but it didn't sound like mine anymore. It sounded like a word he'd practiced, like a line from a script he'd rehearsed alone in his car. My skin went cold. I watched his mouth move and realized I was about to hear something I'd been avoiding for years. Something I'd felt creeping closer every time we stopped touching, every time we ate dinner in silence, every time he chose his phone over my face. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, white, crisp, the kind of envelope that holds documents, not love letters. He held it out between us like an offering, unlike a severance package, and I stared at it the way you stare at a car accident, unable to look away, unable to process what you're seeing. My hands stayed at my sides. I didn't reach for it, not yet, not while I could still pretend this was something else. He cleared his throat, and the sound was so ordinary, so mundane, that it made everything worse. How could something this devastating sound so routine? He said he'd been thinking, that he wasn't happy, that he hadn't been happy for a long time. And then, as if apologizing for bad weather, he said he wanted a divorce. The word hung in the air between us, sharp and clean, cutting through every excuse I'd ever made for him. For us, for the silence I'd mistaken for peace. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I didn't crumble the way I thought I would. I just stood there staring at the envelope, feeling my life rearrange itself in real time. I looked up at him, searching his face for something, regret, hesitation, anything that suggested this wasn't already decided. But his eyes were calm, resolved. He'd already grieved this marriage. He'd already let me go. I was just catching up. My voice came out quieter than I expected, steadier than I felt. I asked him how long he'd known. He shifted his weight, looked past me toward the living room where our friends were still laughing, still celebrating, still believing the illusion we'd spent years building. He said he didn't know exactly, that it had been gradual, that there wasn't one moment, just a slow realization that we'd become strangers who shared a lease. I nodded, and something inside me cracked. Not my heart, but the fragile architecture of denial I'd built around it. He wasn't wrong. We had become strangers. I just hadn't wanted to admit that I'd felt it too, that I'd been lonely in this marriage long before he handed me papers, that I'd been too afraid of being alone to acknowledge I already was. He said my name again, Victoria. And this time it sounded like goodbye. Like the final time a teacher calls your name at graduation. Formal. Final. A closing. He asked if I wanted to read the papers now or later, and the casualness of the question made me want to laugh, to scream, to ask him if he understood what he was doing, if he knew that this envelope contained the death certificate of everything I'd tried to save. But I didn't say any of that. I took the envelope. It was lighter than I expected, thin. Just a few pages to summarize years of trying, of compromising, of believing that love was supposed to be hard work instead of mutual joy. I held it against my chest and felt the weight of it settle somewhere deeper than my hands. He looked relieved. Not happy, but lighter. As if passing this to me had freed him from something I was only now beginning to feel. He touched my arm, brief, awkward, already distant, and said we could talk more later, that he didn't want to ruin my birthday. I almost laughed, almost told him it was already ruined, that you can't unring a bell, that you can't ask for a divorce and then pretend the party can go on. But I didn't. I nodded. He walked back toward the living room, and I stood there in the hallway, holding the end of my marriage in my hands, wondering how long I'd been rehearsing this moment without realizing it. The music was still playing, and as someone dropped a glass and it shattered with a sound so sharp it pulled me back into my body. I looked down at the envelope, then at the closed door behind me, and realized I had a choice. I could walk back into that room and keep pretending, keep smiling, keep playing the role of the woman who had it all together. Or I could stay here, in this hallway, and finally let myself feel the truth I'd been avoiding. That my marriage had been over long before tonight. That I had known, somewhere deep and hidden, that this was coming. That I had been so busy managing his emotions, his comfort, his needs, that I had forgotten to ask myself one simple question. Was I happy? And the answer I'd been swallowing for years, was no, I wasn't. I hadn't been for a long time. I pressed the envelope against my chest and let the weight of that truth settle over me like a blanket I'd been too cold to reach for. The party continued without me, and for the first time in years, I didn't rush to rejoin it. There was a night, maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3, when he came home and didn't say hello. He dropped his keys on the counter, walked past me into the bedroom and closed the door. Not slammed, just closed. I stood in the kitchen, hands wet from washing dishes, and waited for him to come back out. To explain. To say something that would make it make sense. He didn't. I dried my hands, walked to the door, and stood there with my knuckles hovering an inch from the wood. I could hear him moving inside, the soft rustle of clothes, the creak of the bed. I wanted to knock, I wanted to ask if he was okay, if we were okay, if something had happened that I needed to know about. But I didn't. I lowered my hand, walked back to the kitchen, and finished the dishes in silence, because asking felt like accusing. And I didn't want to be that kind of wife. The kind who demanded explanations, who couldn't give her husband space, who made everything about her. So I swallowed the question, put it in the same place I'd been storing all the others, and told myself it was maturity. That good wives don't pry. That love is trusting someone even when they pull away. It became a pattern. He'd come home late, tired, distant, and I'd greet him with a smile that asked nothing. I'd plate his dinner, sit across from him while he scrolled through his phone, and pretend the silence was comfortable. Sometimes he'd look up and catch me staring. He'd ask what was wrong and I'd say nothing, because how do you explain that you're mourning a conversation that never happened? That you're grieving the intimacy you used to have? The nights you stayed up talking until your voices went hoarse, the way he used to reach for your hand without thinking? You don't. You smile. You say you're fine. You learn to live in the space between what you feel and what you're allowed to say. And slowly, quietly. You forget that you're allowed to say anything at all. I became fluent in the language of silence. I learned to read his moods in the way he parked the car, the way he set down his bag, the way he avoided my eyes. I adapted. I adjusted. I made myself smaller so he wouldn't have to make room. And I told myself that was love. That sacrifice was love. That silence was respect. One morning, after a night where we slept back to back without touching, I asked him if we were okay. It was casual, light, asked over coffee like I was asking about the weather. He looked at me, was surprised, maybe even annoyed, and said we were fine. Why wouldn't we be? I nodded, stirred sugar into my cup, and let it go. Because fine was enough. Fine meant we weren't fighting. Fine meant we were still together, still functioning, still maintaining the image we'd built. And I had learned to survive on fine, to stretch it thin enough to cover all the cracks, to convince myself that other couples had it worse, that we were lucky, that love didn't have to feel like fireworks to be real. But fine is a low bar. Fine is what you say when you've stopped hoping for good. Fine is what you accept when you're too tired to ask for more. And I was so tired. Tired of wondering, tired of waiting, tired of pretending that a marriage held together by politeness was the same as a marriage held together by love. But I didn't say that. I finished my coffee, kissed him on the cheek, and went to work, carrying the weight of everything I didn't say like stones in my pockets. There were other moments, smaller, quieter, but just as telling. The time he forgot my birthday, and I laughed it off. The night I reached for him in bed and he said he was tired. The conversation where I mentioned wanting kids and he changed the subject so smoothly I didn't even realize it until hours later. Each time I had a choice. I could speak up. I could say, "This hurt me. This matters. I need us to talk about this." But I didn't. Because speaking up felt like starting a fight. And I had been raised to believe that good women keep the peace, that strong women don't complain, that love is enduring, not demanding. So I endured. I built a life around unsaid things, around swallowed feelings, and around questions I was too afraid to ask because I didn't want to hear the answers. And in doing so, I became a woman my husband didn't have to fight for, a woman who asked for nothing, a woman who made it so easy to take her for granted that he forgot she was even there. The saddest part? I thought that made me strong. I thought that made me mature. I didn't realize I was disappearing until there was almost nothing left. The night before my birthday, we sat on the couch watching a show neither of us cared about. His phone buzzed. He picked it up, smiled at the screen, and typed something back. I watched his thumbs move fast and confident and wondered who made him smile like that. Who got the version of him that was present, engaged, alive? I wanted to ask. I wanted to reach over, take the phone from his hands and say, "Look at me. See me. Fight for this. For us." But I didn't. I turned back to the TV, pulled a blanket over my lap, and let the moment pass, because by then I had already accepted the truth I didn't want to name, that he had checked out, that we were coasting on momentum, not love. That I had spent so long avoiding the hard conversations that there was nothing left to save. The next night, he handed me divorce papers at my own birthday party, and I realized, in a cruel flash of clarity, that I had been rehearsing for this moment every time I chose silence over honesty, that I had trained him to leave me by never giving him a reason to stay. She never liked me. I knew that the first time we met, when she smiled with her mouth but not her eyes, when she asked what I did for a living and then nodded too slowly. Like she was calculating my worth in real time. She was polite. Always polite. The kind of polite that cuts deeper than insults because you can't call it out without looking paranoid. She'd compliment my dress, then add, "I could never wear something that bold." She'd ask about my family, then pause just long enough after my answer to make it clear she found them lacking. She was a master of the unsaid insult, the backhanded blessing, the comment that left you feeling small without giving you anything concrete to defend yourself against. And I, desperate to be loved by her because I loved her son, smiled through every single one. I told myself she was protective, that she just needed time, that once she saw how much I loved him, how hard I worked to make him happy, she'd come around. I was wrong. She never came around. She just got quieter, more surgical, more precise in the way she dismantled my confidence, one polite sentence at a time. There was a dinner, maybe 6 months into the marriage, where she asked me, in front of the whole family, if I planned to keep working after we had kids. The table went quiet. I felt everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my answer, and I stumbled through some half-response about how we hadn't decided yet, how it would depend on circumstances, how we'd figure it out together. She nodded, sipped her wine, and said, "Well, a mother's place is with her children, but I suppose things are different now." The implication hung in the air like smoke. That I was selfish, that I was prioritizing career over family, that I wasn't the kind of woman her son deserved. My husband said nothing. He cut his steak, chewed slowly, and let her words settle over me without interference. I looked at him, waiting for him to defend me, to say something, anything, that would signal he was on my side. He didn't. And in that moment, I learned a lesson I would carry for years. His silence was his answer. When he didn't defend me, he was agreeing with her. When he let her words land without pushback, he was telling me that my feelings mattered less than keeping the peace. And I, ever the peacekeeper myself, swallowed my hurt and moved on. She had opinions about everything. The way I decorated our home, too modern, too cold. The way I dressed, too casual for a woman my age. The way I spoke, too direct, too American, not soft enough. She never said I was wrong outright. She just offered suggestions wrapped in concern, observations wrapped in care. You know, darling, no men appreciate women who make them feel needed. You're so independent, it's wonderful, really. But sometimes a man wants to feel like a provider. I heard the subtext. I was too much, too self-sufficient, too unwilling to play the role she thought I should. And the worst part? I started to believe her. I started second-guessing myself, softening my edges, making myself more palatable, more traditional, more like the woman she thought her son deserved. I stopped talking about my promotions at work. I stopped correcting him when he was wrong. I started asking for his help with things I didn't actually need help with, just so he could feel useful. I shrank myself to fit the mold she had cast, and I told myself it was compromise, that it was growth, that it was what love required. Then came the comments about children. She wanted grandchildren. No, she demanded them. Every holiday, every phone call, every visit ended with some version of the same question. So, when are you two going to make me a grandmother? At first, I laughed it off. Then I started avoiding her calls. Then I started dreading family gatherings, knowing that at some point, in front of everyone, she would bring it up again. And my husband would sit there, silent, letting her pressure me, letting her make me feel like I was failing at the one job that mattered to her. I wanted kids. I did. But I also wanted to feel ready. I wanted to feel secure in my marriage first. I wanted to know that we were solid, that we could handle the stress, that we were partners before we became parents. But his mother didn't care about any of that. To her, I was a vessel, a means to an end. And my husband, by his silence, agreed. The final straw came at a dinner a year before the divorce. She pulled me aside, put her hand on my arm and said, "You know, if you're having trouble conceiving, there are doctors who can help. I can give you some names." I wasn't having trouble conceiving. We weren't even trying. But she'd made up her mind that I was the problem, that I was the reason her son didn't have the life she'd envisioned for him. And I realized, standing there in her kitchen, that I would never be enough for her, that no version of me, softer, quieter, more traditional, would ever earn her approval. Because the problem wasn't me. The problem was that I wasn't her, and her son had married me anyway. I stopped trying after that, stopped seeking her approval, stopped pretending her comments didn't hurt. I stopped showing up to dinners with a smile I didn't feel. My husband noticed. He asked why I was being distant with his mother, why I couldn't just be nice, why I had to make everything so difficult. I told him. I listed every comment, every dig, every moment she'd made me feel small, and I waited for him to finally see it, to finally defend me. He sighed. He said she didn't mean it that way, that I was being too sensitive, that she was just old-fashioned and I needed to give her grace. And in that moment I understood. He would always choose her. Not because he loved her more, but because it was easier, because standing up to her required courage he didn't have, because letting me absorb her cruelty was simpler than confronting it. I walked away from that conversation knowing my marriage had a third party I could never compete with, and that the man I loved would always side with her. When he handed me divorce papers a year later, I wasn't surprised. His mother had been writing the script all along. He was just reading his lines. His phone was face up on the counter. He was in the shower. I was making lunch, something quick and forgettable, when the screen lit up with a notification. I glanced at it. Instinct, not suspicion, and saw a name I didn't recognize. The message preview was short. Just a sentence. Something about missing him. Something that made my stomach drop like a stone through water. I froze. The knife in my hand hovered above the cutting board, suspended in the air between action and paralysis. The water was still running in the bathroom. He wouldn't be out for at least another 5 minutes. I could pick up the phone. I could read the full conversation. I could finally know what my gut had been screaming at me for months, but I didn't. I set the knife down carefully, wiped my hands on a towel, and turned back to the stove. I stirred pasta that didn't need stirring and told myself I was respecting his privacy. That looking through his phone would make me the villain. That if I didn't see it, it wasn't real. That if I didn't know, I didn't have to act. And acting, confronting, demanding, breaking open the life we'd built, felt more terrifying than pretending everything was fine. The phone buzzed again. And again. I didn't look. I turned the volume up on the speaker in the living room, letting music drown out the sound of my own thoughts. He came out of the shower, grabbed his phone without a word, and walked into the bedroom. I heard the door click shut. I heard the low murmur of his voice, soft, careful, the tone he used to use with me. And I stood there in the kitchen, hands gripping the counter, breathing through the tightness in my chest, convincing myself that I was overreacting. That he was probably talking to a friend, a co-worker, his mother, anyone but the person my gut was screaming about. I drained the pasta, plated it, called him to the table. He came out, phone in his pocket, and ate without meeting my eyes. I asked how his day was. He said fine. I asked if he had plans later. He said maybe. I nodded, pushed food around my plate, and let the silence swallow everything I wanted to say. Because asking would mean admitting I didn't trust him. And if I admitted that, if I opened that door, I'd have to face what was on the other side. I wasn't ready. I wasn't brave enough. More, so I chose ignorance. I chose the illusion of peace over the certainty of pain. But ignorance isn't bliss. It's corrosive. It eats at you slowly, turning every moment of normalcy into suspicion. I started noticing things I'd trained myself to overlook. The way he angled his phone away from me, the way he smiled at the screen and then cleared his expression when he realized I was watching, the way he took calls in the other room, in the car, anywhere I couldn't hear. I started checking the time he came home, cross-referencing it with the explanations he gave. I started listening to the tone of his voice when he said he loved me, searching for sincerity, finding only habit. I became a detective in my own marriage, gathering evidence I refused to use because using it would mean ending everything. And I wasn't ready to be alone. I wasn't ready to admit I'd chosen the wrong man. I wasn't ready to be the woman whose marriage failed, whose instincts were right, whose efforts weren't enough. So I collected the clues and buried them deep, building a case I would never present because the verdict was too painful to accept. There was a moment, weeks after that first message, when I almost broke. We were lying in bed, backs to each other, the space between us feeling wider than the mattress. His phone was on the nightstand, buzzing softly. Once, twice, 3 times. He didn't move, didn't reach for it, didn't even flinch. And I realized he was waiting for me to fall asleep, waiting for me to stop being a witness so he could respond. I lay there, eyes open in the dark, and made a decision. I could roll over. I could ask who was texting him this late. I could demand the truth, force the conversation, shatter the fragile pretense we were both clinging to. Or I could close my eyes, pretend to sleep. Let him think I didn't notice. Let him have his secrets if it meant I could keep my denial. I closed my eyes. I heard him pick up the phone, the soft glow of the screen illuminating the room for a moment before he turned away. I heard him typing, the rhythm quick and comfortable, the sound of someone who wasn't conflicted. And I lay there, pretending to sleep, hating myself for being too weak to confront him, too scared to lose him, too tired to keep fighting for a marriage that was already lost. The irony is, I thought I was protecting us. I thought that by not asking, by not pushing, by not forcing him to choose, I was giving the marriage space to heal. But silence doesn't heal anything. It just lets the wound fester. And by the time he handed me divorce papers, I realized I had been complicit in my own heartbreak. That I had known somewhere deep and undeniable that he was emotionally, maybe physically gone. That I had seen the messages, felt the distance, noticed the change, and chosen not to fight because fighting required a level of self-respect I no longer had. I had spent so long making excuses for him, for us, for the slow disintegration of everything we'd built, that I forgot I deserved someone who didn't make me question my worth, someone who didn't make me feel crazy for noticing what was obvious, someone who didn't require me to ignore my instincts just to keep the peace. When he left, I didn't just lose him. I lost the version of myself who thought love was supposed to hurt, who thought silence was strength, who thought choosing ignorance was the same as choosing grace. And maybe that loss, painful as it was the thing that finally set me free. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days. I walked past it every morning, every evening, every time I needed water or coffee or a reason to pretend I was okay. It didn't move. It didn't open itself. It just sat there patient and unyielding, a tombstone for a marriage I'd spent years trying to resurrect. I knew what was inside. He'd told me. Divorce papers. Standard. Clean. No drama. Just a legal dissolution of everything we'd promised each other in front of people who'd believed we'd make it. I didn't need to read them. I didn't need to see the clauses, the terms, the cold language that reduced years of my life to bullet points and signatures. But I also couldn't bring myself to throw them away. So they sat, and I sat, and we existed in the same space avoiding each other, waiting for someone to make the first move. On the 3rd night, I opened a bottle of wine. I poured a glass I didn't want and sat at the table with the envelope in front of me. The paper felt expensive. Heavy. The kind of stationery that makes bad news feel official. I slid my finger under the seal, tearing it open with a sound that felt too loud in the silence. The papers inside were neat, precise, organized in a way that made me think he'd hired someone good, someone who knew how to make endings look professional. I read through them slowly, not because I was looking for loopholes or hidden clauses, but because I needed to understand what I was signing: the division of assets, the agreement on debts, the acknowledgement that there were no children, no shared properties that required further negotiation. Everything was fair, equitable, almost kind in its simplicity. And that somehow made it worse, because it confirmed what I'd been feeling for years, that our marriage had been so emotionally empty that even its ending was efficient. There was no fight, no messiness, no moment where he'd have to confront what he was losing, because he'd already let it go. I was just paperwork now, a task to complete, a chapter to close so he could move on to whatever, whoever, was waiting on the other side. I picked up the pen he'd left clipped to the front page, black ink, smooth, the kind of pen that doesn't hesitate or smudge. I held it above the signature line and felt the weight of it. Not the pen, but the act. The finality. And the understanding that once I signed, there was no pretending anymore. No more excuses, no more waiting for him to change, for us to change, for love to suddenly become enough. This was it. The end I'd been rehearsing in my head for years, finally arriving in ink. I signed my name. Victoria Mitchell. The letters felt foreign, like I was signing someone else's life away. I flipped to the next page, signed again, and again, and again. Each signature a small death, a quiet goodbye to the woman I'd been when we met, the woman who believed love was enough, who thought effort could substitute for compatibility, who convinced herself that enduring was the same as thriving. By the time I reached the final page, my hand was shaking. Not from sadness, from relief. And that realization that I was relieved this was over broke something open inside me. I wasn't crying because I was losing him. I was crying because I'd wasted so much time trying to keep something that had been dead for years. Because I'd convinced myself that staying was noble, that silence was strength, so that I could love him enough for both of us. But you can't. You can't love someone into loving you back. You can't fix a marriage by yourself. And you can't stay small and quiet and convenient and expect to be cherished. I learned that too late, but I learned it. I stacked the papers neatly, slid them back into the envelope, and set it by the door. He'd pick it up tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever it was convenient for him. I didn't care. I was done waiting, done adjusting my life around his absence, done pretending that the bare minimum was enough because I was too afraid to ask for more. I poured another glass of wine, this one I actually wanted, and sat in the stillness of my apartment. It was quiet, but not the suffocating quiet of avoidance. This was different. This was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, or when the damage is done but the air finally clears. I felt lighter, not happy, not yet, but unburdened. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The papers were signed, the marriage was over, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to smile through the pain or perform strength I didn't feel. I could just be. Broken, yes. Grieving, yes. But finally, undeniably, mine. Later that week, he came to pick up the envelope. He knocked softly, like he was afraid of disturbing me, and I almost laughed. After everything, after the silence, the distance, the divorce papers handed to me at my own birthday party, he was worried about disturbing me. I opened the door, handed him the envelope. He took it without looking inside, as if he trusted that I'd done what I was supposed to do. And I had. Not because I was obedient, but because I was done. Done fighting, done hoping, done believing that if I just waited a little longer, tried a little harder, he'd remember why he married me. He said thank you. I nodded. He started to say something else, maybe an apology, maybe an explanation, but I closed the door before he could finish. I didn't need to hear it, didn't need closure or validation or a neat little bow on the end of our story. I'd already given myself closure the moment I signed my name. The moment I chose to stop waiting for him to choose me. He was gone, and I was still here. And that, in the strangest way, felt like a beginning. Maya showed up unannounced 2 days after he collected the papers. She didn't text first, or didn't call to ask if I was up for company. She just appeared at my door with takeout, wine, and the kind of determined expression that said she wasn't leaving until I talked. I let her in because refusing would have required more energy than I had. She set the food on the counter, poured 2 glasses without asking, and sat across from me at the table like she was settling in for a long night. I picked at the noodles she'd brought, pushing them around the container, and waited for her to say something comforting, something soft, something that would let me off the hook. She didn't. She took a sip of her wine, looked at me with eyes that had known me since college, and asked the one question I'd been avoiding. When did you stop feeling safe with him? The question landed like a punch. Not aggressive, but precise. Aimed at the thing I'd been hiding from everyone, including myself. I opened my mouth to say something dismissive, to laugh it off, to redirect, to tell her I was fine and she didn't need to worry. But the words didn't come. Because the truth was, I didn't know when I stopped feeling safe. It hadn't been a single moment. It had been a slow erosion, a quiet dismantling of trust that happened so gradually I didn't notice until there was nothing left. Maya waited. She didn't fill the silence with reassurances or distractions. She just sat there, patient and unflinching, refusing to let me off the hook. So I started talking. I told her about the night he came home and didn't say hello, about the messages I saw and chose not to read, about the way his mother spoke to me and he never defended me, about the birthday party, the envelope, the divorce papers I signed in my kitchen while he was already moving on. I told her everything, and with each confession, I felt something inside me crack open, not breaking, but releasing. Like I'd been holding my breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. When I finished, Maya didn't offer sympathy. She didn't tell me it wasn't my fault or that he was an asshole or any of the things friends are supposed to say to make you feel better. Instead, she leaned forward, elbows on the table, and asked another question. Why didn't you leave sooner? It wasn't accusatory. It was curious, genuinely curious. Like she was trying to understand how someone as smart, as capable, as self-aware as I'd always been could stay in a marriage that was suffocating her. I bristled, felt the defensiveness rise in my chest like a wave. I wanted to tell her she didn't understand, that it was more complicated than that leaving isn't as simple as deciding you're unhappy. But even as I formed the excuses in my mind, I knew they were just that. Excuses. Reasons I'd given myself to justify staying when every part of me knew I should go. So instead of defending myself, I told her the truth. I told her I was scared. Scared of being alone, scared of admitting I'd made a mistake, scared of what people would say, what his mother would say, what my own family would think, scared that if I left, I'd be proving that I wasn't strong enough, wasn't patient enough, wasn't woman enough to make it work. Maya listened without interrupting. When I finally stopped talking, when the silence stretched long enough that I started to feel embarrassed by how much I'd revealed, she reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was firm, grounding. She said, "You weren't weak for staying. You were scared, but you're not scared anymore, and that's what matters." Something about the way she said it, calm, certain, without judgment, made me believe her. Not completely. Not yet, but enough to loosen the knot of shame I'd been carrying. She asked more questions that night. Hard ones. Questions that made me confront parts of myself I'd been avoiding. When did I start making myself smaller? When did I start apologizing for things that weren't my fault? When did I stop believing I deserved to be loved the way I wanted to be loved? Each question was a mirror, reflecting back the woman I'd become in that marriage, quiet, accommodating, invisible. And each answer was a small excavation, digging up the parts of myself I'd buried to keep the peace. We talked until the food went cold and the wine ran out. At some point, Maya asked if I regretted marrying him. I thought about it, really thought about it, and I realized I didn't. Not exactly. Because marrying him taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. It taught me what I didn't want, what I wouldn't tolerate, what I deserved. It taught me that love without respect is just performance. That effort without reciprocity is just exhaustion. That staying in something that's hurting you doesn't make you strong. It makes you complicit in your own suffering. I told her all of that, and she nodded like she'd been waiting for me to figure it out. She said, You know what the hardest part is going to be? I shook my head. She smiled, sad, knowing. The kind of smile that comes from experience. Forgiving yourself, she said, for staying as long as you did, for not seeing it sooner, for all the times you chose him over you. She was right. That was the hardest part. Not the divorce, not the loneliness, not the embarrassment of admitting my marriage failed. It was forgiving myself for participating in my own disappearance, for believing that silence was love, for thinking that enduring was enough. Maya stayed until after midnight. When she finally got up to leave, she hugged me at the door, tight, the kind of hug that says more than words can. She told me to call her if I needed anything at all. I nodded, thanked her, and watched her walk down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over me. She hadn't fixed anything, hadn't made the pain go away, but she'd done something more important. She'd made me face it. She'd refused to let me hide behind excuses or denial or the polite fiction that I was fine. She'd asked the questions I was too afraid to ask myself, and in doing so, she'd given me something I desperately needed. Permission to be honest. Permission to be angry. Permission to grieve not just the marriage, but the version of myself I'd lost trying to save it. I went to bed that night with her questions still echoing in my mind. When did I stop feeling safe? Why didn't I leave sooner? What do I deserve? And for the first time, I didn't have answers. But I was finally ready to find them. The apartment felt different after he left. Not bigger, exactly, but emptier in a way that had nothing to do with furniture or space. It was the absence of his presence, his keys on the counter, his shoes by the door, the sound of him moving through rooms I'd once thought of as ours. Now they were just mine, and I didn't know what to do with that. I walked through each room slowly, cataloguing the things he'd taken and the things he'd left behind. The couch we'd picked out together, the coffee table I'd wanted and he'd agreed to, the framed photos I'd already turned face down because looking at them hurt too much. Everything was still here, but the meaning had drained out of it. These weren't shared things anymore. They were just objects, witnesses to a life I'd tried to build and failed to sustain. I sat on the couch, pulled my knees to my chest, and let myself feel the full weight of what I'd lost. Not him. I'd lost him long before the papers were signed. But the dream of him. The version of us I'd been clinging to, the marriage I kept trying to resurrect even after it was clear there was nothing left to save. I thought about the night we met, how confident I'd been, how sure. He'd made me laugh and I'd thought that was enough. He'd listened when I talked, and I'd thought that meant he cared. He'd chosen me, and I'd thought that meant I was worthy. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped choosing myself. I'd stopped asking if I was happy, if my needs were being met, if the person I was becoming in this marriage was someone I even recognized. I'd become so focused on being the woman he needed, accommodating, flexible, low maintenance, that I'd forgotten to ask if he was the man I needed. And the answer, the one I'd been avoiding for years, was no, he wasn't. Not because he was cruel or malicious, but because he was indifferent. He'd stopped trying, stopped seeing me, stopped showing up. And I'd let him. I'd made excuses for his absence, filled the gaps with my own effort, convinced myself that if I just loved him hard enough, he'd remember why he chose me. But you can't love someone into caring. You can't effort your way into being valued. And I'd learned that the hardest way possible. I started making a list, not of things to do or errands to run, but of moments. Moments I should have spoken up and didn't. Moments I felt disrespected and swallowed it. Moments I knew something was wrong and chose to ignore it because facing it felt too hard. The list grew longer than I expected. Pages and pages of small betrayals. Not his betrayals. But mine. Times I betrayed myself by staying quiet. Times I betrayed my own needs by prioritizing his comfort. times I betrayed my intuition by letting him convince me I was overreacting. Each entry was a reckoning, a confrontation with the woman I'd been and the choices I'd made. And as I wrote, I felt something shift. Not relief, not yet, but clarity. I could see it now, the pattern, the cycle, the way I'd participated in my own erasure. It wasn't entirely my fault. He'd played his part and his mother had played hers, and circumstances had conspired to make leaving harder than staying. But I'd also made choices. And some of those choices had hurt me more than he ever did. I thought about the night I saw the messages and didn't look. About the times he came home distant and I didn't ask why. About the birthday party, the balloons, and the cake, the way I'd performed happiness while my marriage was collapsing in real time. I'd been so afraid of conflict, so desperate to be seen as easy and agreeable, that I'd made it effortless for him to take me for granted. I'd trained him to expect nothing from me. No complaints, no demands, no consequences. And then I'd been surprised when he gave me nothing in return. The math was simple. Brutal. But simple. I'd accepted less than I deserved, and that's exactly what I got. And while I couldn't go back and change those choices, while I couldn't undo the years I'd spent shrinking myself to fit a marriage that was never going to work, I could acknowledge them. I could own them. I could say, out loud and without excuse, that I'd failed myself, that I'd let fear dictate my decisions, that I'd chosen the illusion of peace over the discomfort of honesty, and that I would never, ever do that again. The hardest part wasn't admitting he'd hurt me. It was admitting I'd let him, that I'd seen the red flags and ignored them, that I'd felt the distance and bridged it with my own effort instead of demanding he meet me halfway, that I'd known deep down that this marriage was dying, and I'd kept trying to resuscitate it anyway because admitting defeat felt worse than living in limbo. I'd enabled my own suffering. And that realization, that I was complicit, that I'd had agency even when I felt powerless, was both devastating and liberating. Because if I'd had a hand in creating this mess, then I also had the power to create something different. I wasn't a victim. I was a participant. And now I could choose to participate differently. I could choose honesty over politeness. I could choose my own needs over someone else's comfort. I could choose to walk away from anything that required me to be smaller, quieter, less than I was. The marriage was over, but my life wasn't. And standing there in the wreckage of what I'd allowed, surrounded by the debris of years spent trying to be enough for someone who would never see me, I made a promise to myself. I would never again love someone more than I loved myself. I would never again silence my own voice to keep the peace. I would never again stay somewhere I wasn't celebrated, respected, cherished. I deserved more, and I was finally ready to demand it. The first few weeks after the divorce were strange, not painful in the way I expected, sharp, acute, unbearable, but disorienting. Like walking through a house you thought you knew and realizing the walls had moved. I kept reaching for routines that no longer existed. I'd make coffee for two out of habit, then stare at the extra cup like it was evidence of a crime. I'd start to tell him something funny that happened at work, then remember he wasn't there. That he wouldn't be there. That the person I'd been sharing my life with for years was now a stranger I'd probably never speak to again. It felt surreal, not sad exactly, but hollow, like I was living in the echo of a life that had already ended. But slowly, quietly, something else began to emerge. Space. Not the empty kind, but the breathable kind. The kind that lets you stretch without hitting walls. I started doing things I'd stopped doing somewhere along the way. Small things. And I played music he didn't like. I left dishes in the sink overnight because I was tired and there was no one to judge me for it. I stayed up late reading, lights on, sprawled across the bed, in a way I'd never done when I was sharing it. And each small act of reclaiming my space felt like an act of rebellion. A quiet declaration that I was allowed to exist without accommodating anyone else. One morning I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about him yet. Not in a malicious way. I didn't wish him harm or hope he was suffering. I just hadn't thought about him. And that felt monumental. For months, he'd been the first thing on my mind when I woke up and the last thing before I fell asleep. I'd measured every decision against how he'd react, every choice against what he'd think. But that morning, I'd woken up thinking about myself. About what I wanted for breakfast, what I wanted to do that day, what I wanted from my life. And I realized I had no idea. I'd spent so long defining myself in relation to him, as his wife, his partner, his support system, that I'd forgotten who I was without him. The realization should have been terrifying. But instead it felt like possibility. Like a blank page. Like the chance to write a new story where I wasn't a supporting character in someone else's narrative. So I started small. I made a list of things I'd always wanted to do but never did because he wasn't interested or I was too busy managing his needs. I signed up for a pottery class. I booked a solo trip to a city I'd always wanted to visit. I started saying no to things I didn't want to do and yes to things that scared me. And with each small step, I felt myself coming back. Not the woman I'd been before him. She was gone and I didn't want her back. But someone new. Someone stronger, wiser, less willing to compromise her own happiness for the comfort of others. I also started speaking up. Not loudly, not aggressively, but honestly. I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. I stopped softening my opinions to make them more palatable. I stopped laughing at jokes I didn't find funny just to keep the mood light. And at first, it felt awkward, uncomfortable, like I was wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. People noticed. A colleague made a comment about how I'd changed, and there was judgment in her voice, like being different was a bad thing. But I didn't shrink. I didn't explain or justify or try to make her feel better about my transformation. I just smiled and said, yeah, I have. Because I had changed. The woman who stayed silent to keep the peace was gone. The woman who swallowed her feelings to avoid conflict was gone. The woman who believed that being easy to love was more important than being truly loved was gone. And in her place was someone who understood that her voice mattered, that her needs mattered, that she didn't have to earn the right to take up space. She already had it. She'd always had it. She just hadn't believed it until now. There were moments when I missed him. Or rather, I missed the idea of him, the companionship, the shared routines, the comfort of having someone to come home to, even if that someone had stopped really seeing me years ago. But then I'd remember the silence, the loneliness I felt even when he was sitting right next to me, the way I'd shrunk myself to fit into a marriage that was never big enough for both of us. And I'd realize I didn't miss him. I missed the fantasy, the version of us I kept trying to create, the marriage I thought we'd have if I just tried harder, loved better, asked for less. But that marriage never existed. It was always a fiction, a story I told myself to avoid facing the truth. And now that the truth was out, now that I was living in reality instead of denial, I felt lighter, freer, more myself than I'd been in years. It wasn't the fairy tale ending I'd imagined when I said, I do, but it was honest, and that mattered more than I'd ever understood. One night, months after the divorce was finalized, I sat down and wrote him a letter. Not to send. I had nothing left to say to him, and he didn't deserve access to my inner world anymore. But I needed to write it for myself. I needed to say all the things I'd never said, all the feelings I'd swallowed, all the truths I'd been too afraid to speak. I wrote about the night he asked for a divorce on my birthday and how I didn't fight it because I was too tired to fight for someone who'd already given up. I wrote about his mother, the messages, the silence, the loneliness of being married to someone who'd checked out emotionally long before he checked out legally. I wrote about the woman I'd become in that marriage, small, quiet, accommodating, and how much I resented her for staying as long as she did. But I also wrote about the woman I was becoming, the one who spoke up, the one who walked away, The one who finally understood that love without respect is just a cage you decorate to make it feel like home. When I finished, and I read it once, then folded it up and put it in a drawer. I didn't need to send it, didn't need his validation or acknowledgement or apology. I'd said what I needed to say, and that was enough. The truth is, I learned to speak when no one was left to listen. And maybe that's exactly when I needed to learn it, because the most important voice I'd been ignoring wasn't his, it was mine. I'd spent years silencing myself, convincing myself that my feelings didn't matter as much as his comfort, that my needs were negotiable, that speaking up would make me difficult or demanding or unlovable. But I'd been wrong. Silence didn't make me easier to love. It made me easier to ignore. And I was done being ignored. I was done shrinking. I was done apologizing for wanting more. I was done performing a version of myself that made other people comfortable at the expense of my own peace. I'd lost a marriage, but I'd found something more valuable. I'd found my voice. And this time, I wasn't giving it away for anyone. Not for love. Not for approval. Not for the promise of peace. My voice was mine. My life was mine. My story was mine. And I was finally ready to tell it, loud, honest, and without apology. The divorce didn't break me. It freed